An Unbidden Guest. My cousins, Kate and Tom Howard, married at Trinity at Easter time, concluded to commence housekeeping by taking one of those delightfully expensively furnished unfurnished cottages, with which the fashionable watering place of W abounds, from whose rear windows one might almost take a plunge into the surf, the beach beginning at the back door. They went down quite early in May, being in a great hurry to try their domestic experiment, and as the evenings were still cold, they spent them about the open fire, spooning. It was upon one of those nights, about 11 o'clock, that they were startled by a noise, as of some small object falling, soon followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, and then quiet again reigned supreme. At once, Tom, poker in hand, boldly started in search of the burglar, followed by Kate, wildly clutching at his coat tail, and in a state of tremor. They looked upstairs, under the various beds, Kate suggesting that in novels they were always to be found there. The dining room was next explored, where all seemed well, and lastly the kitchen, where they found what was evidently a solution of the mystery. The burglar had entered by the back door, which was found to be unlocked and slightly ajar. The first excitement subsiding, they returned again to the dining room, where Tom, upon closer inspection, then discovered that one of a pair of quaint little pepper pots, wedding gifts, was missing, and other small articles on the sideboard had been slightly disturbed. The next morning, when Kate mildly remonstrated with the queen of the kitchen for her carelessness, she received a shock by being told that it was her usual custom to leave the door open, so that it would be "aisy, convanient loike for the milkmaid." They parted with her, and a new maid was engaged, whose chief qualification for the place that she was most faithful in the discharge of her duties, especially in locking up. While they mourned the loss of the pepper pot, still it seemed so trifling when they thought of that lovely repoussé salad bowl, sent by Aunt Julia, which stood near by, that nothing was said of the loss outside of the family, and the little household settled into its normal state once more of billing and cooing. About a fortnight later, Tom started out one night with an old fisherman, one of the natives, and a local character, to indulge in that delightful pastime, so dear to the heart of man, known as eeling. And as the night was dark, the eels were particularly sporty, so that it was well on towards the wee sma' hours when Tom at last returned to the cottage. He found all excitement within. Kate was in hysterics, and the new maid, also weeping, was industriously applying the camphor bottle to her mistress's nose. The burglar or ghost, as they had now decided, the windows and doors being found to be securely locked this time, had been abroad again, but had succeeded in purloining nothing. His royal ghostship had amused himself apparently by simply walking about. "Oh, Tom, he had on such heavy boots, and was so dreadfully bold about it," said Kate tearfully. From that time Kate became nervous and refused to be left alone. Tom started whenever a door creaked, and the treasure departed hurriedly, saying, "Faith, the house is haunted, sure." After that Kate spent her days in girl hunting, and her nights in answering shadowy advertisements that never materialized. They tried Irish, English, Dutch, and a heathen Chinee, with a sprinkling of colored ladies to vary the monotony. They seemed about to become famous throughout the length and breadth of the land as the family that changes help once a week, when they landed treasure number 2. Shortly after her advent we were all asked down to W to help celebrate their happiness, and, incidentally, to christen the new dinner set. We were not a little surprised at finding Kate so pale and Tom rather distrait. However, after a delightful dinner, that should have filled with pleasure the most exacting bride, we adjourned to the piazza, leaving the men to the contemplation of their cigars. We were enthusiastic in our praise of the house, and congratulated Kate in securing such a prize, when to our horror she burst into tears, and said, "Oh, girls, it's a dreadful place. It's haunted," and then tearfully proceeded with the details, until we all felt creepy and suggested the parlor and lights. It was not long afterwards that Kate discovered that Tom had also related the ghost story to the men that evening, to which Ned Harris had said, laconically, "Rats," and Bob Shaw laughingly remarked, "Tom, old chap, you really shouldn't take your nightcap so strong." About the 1st of July the climax came. The ghost walked again, this time taking not only the remaining pepper pot, but also a silver salt cellar. Evidently he had a penchant for small articles, but unlike former times, everything on the sideboard was in the greatest disorder. Aunt Julia's salad bowl was found on the floor, and not far away the cheese dish, with its contents scattered about. This time one of the windows was found half open. A week later a note came to me from Kate, saying that she and Tom had gone to Saratoga to spend the remainder of the season with her mother. The following spring Tom received a note and parcel from Mr. B., the owner of the house at W., which read as follows: "Dear Mr. Howard, I send you by express 3 articles of silver, which my wife suggests may belong to you, as they are marked with your initials, namely, 2 silver pepper pots and a salt cellar. They were found the other day, during the process of spring house cleaning, in a rat hole, behind the sideboard. I forgot to have the hole stopped up last spring, or to caution you against the water rats. The great fellows will get in, you know. Kind regards to Mrs. Howard. Very truly, John B." The next season the Ghost Club was organized, the badge being a small silver rat, bearing proudly aloft a tiny pepper pot. We thoughtfully offered Tom the presidency, but he declined, with offended dignity, from the effects of which I think he will never fully recover. End of story 15. Story 16 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Dead Woman's Photograph. Virgil Hoyt is a photographer's assistant up at St. Paul, and a man of a good deal of taste. He has been in search of the picturesque all over the West, and hundreds of miles to the north in Canada, and can speak 3 or 4 Indian dialects, and put a canoe through the rapids. That is to say, he is a man of an adventurous sort and no dreamer. He can fight well and shoot well and swim well enough to put up a winning race with the Indian boys, and he can sit all day in the saddle and not dream about it at night. Wherever he goes he uses his camera. The world, Hoyt is in the habit of saying to those who sit with him when he smokes his pipe, was created in 6 days to be photographed. Man, and especially woman, was made for the same purpose. Clouds are not made to give moisture, nor trees to cast shade. They were created for the photographer. In short, Virgil Hoyt's view of the world is whimsical, and he doesn't like to be bothered with anything disagreeable. That is the reason he loathes and detests going to a house of mourning to photograph a corpse. The horribly bad taste of it offends him partly, and partly he is annoyed at having to shoulder, even for a few moments, a part of someone's burden of sorrow. He doesn't like sorrow, and would willingly canoe 500 miles up the cold Canadian rivers to get rid of it. Nevertheless, as assistant photographer, it is often his duty to do this very kind of thing. Not long ago he was sent for by a rich Jewish family at St. Paul to photograph the mother, who had just died. He was very much put out, but he went. He was taken to the front parlor where the dead woman lay in her coffin. It was evident that there was some excitement in the household and that a discussion was going on, but Hoyt wasn't concerned, and so he paid no attention to the matter. The daughter wanted the coffin turned on end, in order that the corpse might face the camera properly, but Hoyt said he could overcome the recumbent attitude and make it appear that the face was taken in the position it would naturally hold in life, and so they went out and left him alone with the dead. The face was a strong and positive one, such as may often be seen among Jewish matrons. Hoyt regarded it with some admiration, thinking to himself that she was a woman who had been used to having her own way. There was a strand of hair out of place. He pushed it back from her brow. A bud lifted its head too high from among the roses on her breast and spoiled the contour of the chin, so he broke it off. He remembered these things later very distinctly, and that his hand touched her bare face 2 or 3 times. Then he took the photographs and left the house. He was very busy at the time, and several days elapsed before he was able to develop the plates. He took them from the bath, in which they had lain with a number of others, and went to work upon them. There were 3 plates, he having taken that number merely as a precaution against any accident. They came up well, but as they developed he became aware of the existence of something in the photograph which had not been apparent to his eye. The mysterious always came under the head of the disagreeable with him, and was therefore to be banished. So he made only a few prints and put the things away out of sight. He hoped that something would intervene to save him from attempting an explanation. But it is a part of the general perplexity of life that things do not intervene as they ought when they ought. So one day his employer asked him what had become of those photographs. He tried to evade him, but it was futile, and he got out the finished photographs and showed them to him. The older man sat staring at them a long time. "Hoyt," said he at length, "you're a young man, and I suppose you have never seen anything like this before. But I have. Not exactly the same thing, but similar phenomena have come my way a number of times since I went into the business, and I want to tell you there are things in heaven and earth not dreamt of." "Oh, I know all that tommy rot," cried Hoyt, angrily. "But when anything happens, I want to know the reason why, and how it is done." "All right," said his employer, "then you might explain why and how the sun rises." But he humored the younger man sufficiently to examine with him the bath in which the plates were submerged, and the plates themselves. All was as it should be, but the mystery was there and could not be done away with. Hoyt hoped against hope that the friends of the dead woman would somehow forget about the photographs, but of course the wish was unreasonable, and one day the daughter appeared and asked to see the photographs of her mother. "Well, to tell the truth," stammered Hoyt, "those didn't come out as well as we could wish." "But let me see them," persisted the lady. "I'd like to look at them anyway." "Well now," said Hoyt, trying to be soothing, as he believed it was always best to be with women. To tell the truth, he was an ignoramus where women were concerned. "I think it would be better if you didn't see them. There are reasons why." He ambled on like this, stupid man that he was. And of course the Jewess said she would see those pictures without any further delay. So poor Hoyt brought them out and placed them in her hand, and then ran for the water pitcher, and had to be at the bother of bathing her forehead to keep her from fainting. For what the lady saw was this. Over the face and flowers and the head of the coffin fell a thick veil, the edges of which touched the floor in some places. It covered the features so well that not a hint of them was visible. "There was nothing over mother's face," cried the lady at length. "Not a thing," acquiesced Hoyt. "I know because I had occasion to touch her face just before I took the picture. I put some of her hair back from her brow." "What does it mean, then?" asked the lady. "You know better than I. There's no explanation in science. Perhaps there's some in psychology." "Well," said the lady, stammering a little and coloring, "mother was a good woman, but she always wanted her own way, and she always had it, too." "Yes?" "And she never would have her picture taken. She didn't admire herself. She said no one should ever see a picture of hers." "So?" said Hoyt meditatively. "Well, she's kept her word, hasn't she?" The two stood looking at the pictures for a time. Then Hoyt pointed to the open blaze in the grate. "Throw them in," he commanded. "Don't let your father see them. Don't keep them yourself. They wouldn't be good things to keep." "That's true enough," said the lady slowly. And she threw them in the fire. Then Virgil Hoyt brought out the plates and broke them before her eyes. And that was the end of it, except that Hoyt sometimes tells the story to those who sit beside him when his pipe is lighted. The Ghost of a Live Man. We were in the South Atlantic Ocean, in the latitude of the island of Fernando Noronha, about 40 degrees 12 minutes south, on board the bark H.G. Johnson, homeward bound from Australia. I was the only passenger, and we had safely rounded Cape Horn, with the barometer at 28 degrees 18 minutes, and yet had somehow miraculously escaped any extremely heavy gale, had light northerly and easterly winds till we reached 20 degrees, and thence the southeast trades were sending us fast on our way to the equator. I sat on deck smoking my pipe, with a glorious full moon shedding its bright pathway across the blue waters, and chatting with the first mate, a man of some 58 years of age, who had followed the sea since he was a boy. For 20 years or more he had been a mate or captain, and many and varied were the experiences he could relate. A thorough sailor and a skilful navigator, he was as honest as the day is long, had a heart as big as an ox, and was an all-around good fellow and genial companion. Some of his yarns might be taken cum grano salis, yet he always positively assured me that he was telling me the truth. An account of a voyage that he made in a whaler from the Southern Ocean to New Bedford seemed to me worthy to be repeated. He had rounded Cape Horn 6 times and the Cape of Good Hope 26 times, besides making many trips across the Western Ocean and to South American ports. I give his account as near as possible in his own words. It was in '71 that I commanded the whaler Mary Jane. We had been out from home for over 3 years, and had on board a full cargo of whale oil, besides 2,000 pounds of whalebone, which was then worth $5 per pound. I had also been fortunate enough to find in a dead whale which we came across a large quantity of ambergris, and our hearts were all very light as we began our homeward voyage, and our thoughts all tended to the hearty welcome which we should receive from wives and sweethearts when we reached our journey's end. Many a night I lay in my berth I had thought with great pleasure of the amount of money that would be coming to me from the proceeds of our voyage when we arrived in New Bedford. I calculated that I had made $12,000 as my share of the proceeds of the whalebone and oil, to say nothing of the ambergris, which I well knew would bring at least $20,000, and one half of which belonged to me. You can therefore imagine that I was well pleased with myself as we went bounding along through the southeast trades. We crossed the equator in longitude 36, and soon after took strong northeast trades, and all was going well as I could wish. We had put the ship in perfect order, painted her inside and out, and you would never have recognized her as the old whaling ship that had for 3 years been plying the Southern Ocean for whales. Never shall I forget the old bull whale that we tackled about 2 degrees to the south of Cape Horn, but that is another story, which I will give you another time. We had just lost the northeast trades and were entering the Gulf Stream. I sat in my cabin with my chart on the table before me rolled up. I had just picked our location on it, and was thinking that in a week or more I should be at home, surrounded by those near and dear to me, and relating to them the story of my great good fortune. It was always my custom to work up my latitude and longitude about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then after supper pick off her position on the chart, have a smoke, and perhaps just before retiring a nip of grog, and then at 8:30 o'clock, as regular as a clock, I would turn in. I am a great smoker, and this day I had been smoking all the afternoon, besides having had 2 or 3 nips. We had a dog on board whom we called Boatswain, who had been out with us all the voyage, and who was afraid of nothing. He had endeared himself to every man on board, and when Boatswain took water, something very serious was in the wind. This night as I sat in the cabin I heard a most dismal howl from Boatswain, and called out to the mate to know what was the matter with the dog. He replied that he reckoned some of the men had been teasing him, and the occurrence soon passed from my mind. Suddenly I saw someone coming down the after companionway into the cabin. I supposed at first it was the mate, and wondered that he had not first spoken to me. But then I noticed that he wore clothes I had never seen on the mate, and as he advanced into the cabin I saw his face. It was the face of a man I had never seen in my life. He was thin and pale and haggard, and as he advanced he looked about the cabin and at the rolled-up chart on the table. There seemed to be an appeal in his eyes, and then there swept over his face a look of intense disappointment, and before I could move or speak he had vanished from my sight. Now I am a very practical man, and I at once straightened myself in my chair and said to myself, "Well, old man, you've smoked one too many pipes today, or else you've had one drink too much, for you have been asleep in your chair and seen a ghost." I was quite satisfied that I had had a dream, especially as I called to the mate and asked him if he had seen anyone come below. He said no, that he had not left the deck for the last hour, and the man at the wheel, directly in front of the door, was sure no one had entered the cabin. So I convinced myself that I had had a very vivid dream, though I could not help thinking of the matter all through the next day. At 8 o'clock the next evening I sat in the same place with my work just finished, and the chart rolled up on the table before me, when suddenly the dog's dismal howl rang through the ship, and looking up I saw those same legs coming down the after companion. My hair fairly stood on end, and yet today surely I was wide awake. I had only smoked one pipe all day, and had not touched a drop of liquor. The same wan, emaciated figure walked into the cabin, glanced inquiringly and appealing at me, and again there spread over his face that look of utter disappointment, as if he had sought something and failed to find it, and again he disappeared. I rushed on deck to the mate and told him all I had seen the last 2 nights, but he made light of it, and assured me I had been asleep or smoking too much. He did not like to suggest that I had been drinking. Still, I could see that the thought that came into his mind was, "The old man has seen him again." I gave up trying to convince him, but requested that the next night, from 8 to 8:30, he should sit with me in the cabin. How the next day passed I cannot tell. I only know that my thoughts never left that ghostly visitant, and somehow I felt that the evening would reveal something to me and the spell be broken. I made up my mind I would speak to the thing, whatever it was, and I felt a sort of security in the presence of the mate, who was a daring fellow and feared neither man nor the devil. Neither rum nor tobacco passed my lips during the next day, and 8 o'clock found the mate and I sitting in the cabin, and this time the chart lay open on the table beside us. Just as 8 bells struck the dog's premonitory wail sounded, and looking up we both saw the figure descending the cabin stairs. We both seemed frozen to our seats, and the strange weirdness of the whole proceeding cast the same spell over the mate and me alike, and we were both unable to move or speak. Slowly the figure proceeded into the cabin and glanced around without a word, but with the same expectant look on his face. His form was even more wasted, his cheeks sunken and his eyes seemed almost out of sight, so deeply were they set in their sockets. As his eye fell on the open chart, a look of supreme joy fairly irradiated his features, and advancing to the table he placed one long, bony finger on the chart, held it for a moment and then again disappeared from our sight. For 5 minutes after he had left us we sat speechless. Then I managed to say, "What do you think of that, Mr. Morris?" "My God, sir, I don't know. It's beyond me." Then my eyes fell on the open chart, and there where the finger had been was a tiny spot of blood, exactly on the point of longitude 63 degrees west and latitude 37 degrees north. We were then only about 50 miles distant from that position, and immediately there came to me the determination to steer the ship there, so I laid her course accordingly, and posted a lookout in the crow's nest. At 5 o'clock in the morning, just as the east began to grow gray, the lookout called out, "Boat on the lee bow," and as we came up to it we found 4 men in it, 3 dead and one with just a remnant of life left in him. We sewed the 3 bodies in canvas and buried them in the ocean, and then gave all our attention to restoring life to the poor emaciated frame, which, I then recognized, was the very man who for 3 successive nights had visited me in my cabin. By judicious and careful nursing, life gradually came back to him, and in 4 days' time he was able to sit up and talk with me in the cabin. It seems he commanded the ship Promise, and she had taken fire and been destroyed, and all hands had to take to the boats. 10 were in the boats at first, but their food had given out, and one by one he had seen them die, and one by one he had cast the bodies overboard. Finally he lost consciousness and knew not whether his 3 remaining companions were dead or alive. Then he said he seemed in a dream to see a ship and tried to go to her for help, but just as he would be going on board of her, something would seem to keep him back. 3 times in his dreams he tried to visit this ship, and the last time there seemed to come to him a certain satisfaction, and he felt that he had succeeded in his object. Turning to my table, he said, "Let me take your chart. I'll show you just where we were." "Stop," said I. "Don't take that chart. It is an old one and all marked over. Mark your position on this new one." He took my pencil and knife, and carefully sharpened his pencil. Then, taking my dividers, he measured his latitude and longitude, and placed a pencil dot at a point on the clean chart. As he lifted his hand, he said, "Oh, excuse me, Captain. I cut my finger in sharpening the pencil and left a drop of blood on the chart." "Never mind," said I, "leave it there." And then I produced the old chart, and there, in an exactly corresponding place, was the drop of blood left by my ghostly visitor. Then, looking steadily into my face, the mate solemnly added, "I can't explain this, sir. Perhaps you can. But I can tell you on my honor it's God's own truth that I have told you." His dead wife's photograph. This story created a sensation when it was first told. It appeared in the papers, and many big physicists and natural philosophers were, at least so they thought, able to explain the phenomenon. I shall narrate the event and also tell the reader what explanation was given, and let him draw his own conclusions. This is what happened. A friend of mine, a clerk in the same office as myself, was an amateur photographer. Let's call him Jones. Jones had a half plate, Sanders camera with a Ross lens and a Thornton Pickard behind lens shutter, with pneumatic release. The plate in question was a Ratton's Ordinary, developed with Ilford Pyro Soda Developer prepared at home. All these particulars I give for the benefit of the more technical reader. Mr. Smith, another clerk in our office, invited Mr. Jones to take the likeness of his wife and sister-in-law. This sister-in-law was the wife of Mr. Smith's elder brother, who was also a government servant, then on leave. The idea of the photograph was that of the sister-in-law. Jones was a keen photographer himself. He had photographed everybody in the office, including the peons and sweepers, and had even supplied every sitter with his copies of his handiwork. So he most willingly consented, and anxiously waited for the Sunday on which the photograph was to be taken. Early on Sunday morning, Jones went to the Smiths. The arrangement of light in the veranda was such that a photograph could only be taken after midday, so he stayed there to breakfast. About 1 in the afternoon all arrangements were complete, and the 2 ladies, Mrs. Smiths, were made to sit in 2 cane chairs, and after long and careful focusing, and moving the camera for about an hour, Jones was satisfied at last, and an exposure was made. Mr. Jones was sure that the plate was all right, and so a second plate was not exposed, although in the usual course of things this should have been done. He wrapped up his things and went home, promising to develop the plate the same night and bring a copy of the photograph the next day to the office. The next day, which was Monday, Jones came to the office very early, and I was the first person to meet him. "Well, Mr. Photographer," I asked, "what success?" "I got the picture all right," said Jones, unwrapping an unmounted picture and handing it over to me. "Most funny, don't you think so?" "No, I don't think it's all right; at any rate I did not expect anything better from you," I said. "No," said Jones, "the funny thing is that the two ladies sat—" "Quite right," I said, "the third stood in the middle." "There was no third lady at all there," said Jones. "Then you imagined she was there, and there we find her." "I tell you there were only two ladies there when I exposed," insisted Jones. He was looking awfully worried. "Do you want me to believe that there were only two persons when the plate was exposed and three when it was developed?" I asked. "That is exactly what has happened," said Jones. "Then it must be the most wonderful developer you used, or was it that this was the second exposure given to the same plate?" "The developer is the one which I have been using for the last 3 years, and the plate the one I charged on Saturday night out of the new box that I had purchased only on Saturday afternoon." A number of other clerks had come up in the meantime, and were taking great interest in the picture and in Jones's statement. It is only right that a description of the picture be given here for the benefit of the reader. I wish I could reproduce the original picture too, but that for certain reasons is impossible. When the plate was actually exposed there were only two ladies, both of whom were sitting in cane chairs. When the plate was developed, it was found that there was in the picture a figure, that of a lady, standing in the middle. She wore a broad-edged dhoti. The reader should not forget that all the characters are indents, only the upper half of her body being visible, the lower being covered up by the low backs of the cane chairs. She was distinctly behind the chairs, and consequently slightly out of focus. Still everything was quite clear. Even her long necklace was visible through the little opening in the dhoti near the right shoulder. She was resting her hands on the back of the chairs, and the fingers were nearly totally out of focus, but a ring on the right finger was clearly visible. She looked like a handsome young woman of 22, short and thin. One of the earrings was also clearly visible, although the face itself was slightly out of focus. One thing, and probably the funniest thing, that we overlooked then but observed afterwards, was that immediately behind the three ladies was a barred window. The two ladies, who were one on each side, covered up the bars to a certain height from the bottom with their bodies, but the lady in the middle was partly transparent because the bars of the window were very faintly visible through her. This fact, however, as I have said already, we did not observe then. We only laughed at Jones and tried to assure him that he was either drunk or asleep. At this moment Smith of our office walked in, removing the trouser clips from his legs. Smith took the unmounted photograph, looked at it for a minute, turned red and blue and green and finally very pale. Of course, we asked him what the matter was, and this was what he said. "The third lady in the middle was my first wife, who has been dead these 8 years. Before her death she asked me a number of times to have her photograph taken. She used to say that she had a presentiment that she might die early. I did not believe in her presentiment myself, but I did not object to the photograph. So one day I ordered the carriage and asked her to dress up. We intended to go to a good professional. She dressed up and the carriage was ready, but as we were going to start, news reached us that her mother was dangerously ill. So we went to see her mother instead. The mother was very ill, and I had to leave her there. Immediately afterwards I was sent away on duty to another station, and so could not bring her back. It was in fact after full 3 months and a half that I returned, and then thought her mother was all right, my wife was not. Within 15 days of my return she died of puerperal fever, after childbirth, and the child died too. A photograph of her was never taken. When she dressed up for the last time on the day that she left my home, she had the necklace and the earrings on, as you see her wearing in the photograph. My present wife has them now, but she does not generally put them on." This was too big a pill for me to swallow, so I at once took French leave from my office, bagged the photograph and rushed out on my bicycle. I went to Mr. Smith's house and looked Mrs. Smith up. Of course, she was much astonished to see a third lady in the picture, but could not guess who she was. This I had expected, as supposing Smith's story to be true, this lady had never seen her husband's first wife. The elder brother's wife, however, recognized the likeness at once, and she virtually repeated the story which Smith had told me earlier that day. She even brought out the necklace and the earrings for my inspection and conviction. They were the same as those in the photograph. All the principal newspapers of that time got hold of the fact, and within a week there was any number of applications for the ghostly photograph. But Mr. Jones refused to supply copies of it to anybody for various reasons, the principal being that Smith would not allow it. I am, however, the fortunate possessor of a copy, which, for obvious reasons, I am not allowed to show to anybody. One copy of the picture was sent to America and another to England. I do not now remember exactly to whom. My own copy I showed to the Reverend Father M.A., D.Sc., B.D., etc., and asked him to find out a scientific explanation for the phenomenon. The following explanation was given by the gentleman. I am afraid I shall not be able to reproduce the learned Father's exact words, but this is what he meant, or at least what I understood him to mean. The girl in question was dressed in this particular way on an occasion, say 10 years ago. Her image was cast on space, and the reflection was projected from one luminous body, one planet, on another till it made a circuit of millions and millions of miles in space, and then came back to earth at the exact moment when our friend Mr. Jones was going to make the exposure. Take for instance the case of a man who is taking a photograph of a mirage. He is photographing place X from place Y, when X and Y are, say, 200 miles apart, and it may be that his camera is facing east while placing X is actually towards the west of place Y. In school I had read a little of science and chemistry, and could make a dry analysis of a salt, but this was an item too big for my limited comprehension. The fact, however, remains, and I believe it, that Smith's first wife did come back to this terrestrial globe of ours over 8 years ago after her death to give a sitting for a photograph in a form which, though it did not affect the retina of our eye, did impress a sensitized plate, in a form that did not affect the retina of the eye, I say, because Jones must have been looking at his sitters at the time when he was pressing the bulb of the pneumatic release of his time and instantaneous shutter. The story is most wonderful, but this is exactly what happened. Smith says this is the first time he has ever seen, or heard from, his dead wife. It's popularly believed in India that a dead wife gives a lot of trouble if she ever revisits this earth. But this is, thank God, not the experience of my friend Mr. Smith. It is now over 7 years since the event mentioned above happened, and the dead girl has never appeared again. I would very much like to have a photograph of the two ladies taken once more, but I have never ventured to approach Smith with the proposal. In fact, I learnt photography myself with a view to take the photograph of the two ladies. But as I have said, I have never been able to speak to Smith about my intention, and probably never shall. The £10 that I spent on my cheap photographic outfit may be a waste. But I have learnt an art which, though rather costly for my limited means, is nevertheless an art worth learning. The Open Door. Here again is something that is very peculiar and not very uncommon. We, myself and 3 friends of mine, were asked by another friend of ours to pass a week's holiday at the suburban residence of the last named. We took an evening train after the office hours, and reached our destination at about 10:30 that night. The place was about 60 miles from Calcutta. Our host had a very large house with a number of disused wings. I do not think many of my readers have any idea of a large residential house in Bengal. Generally it is a quadrangular sort of thing, with a big yard in the center which is called the angan or uthan, a courtyard. On all sides of the courtyard are rooms of all sorts of shapes and sizes. There are generally 2 stories, the lower used as kitchen, godown, storeroom, etc., and the upper as bedrooms, etc. Now this particular house of our friend was of the kind described above. It stood on extensive grounds wooded with fruit and timber trees. There was also a big tank, a miniature lake in fact, which was the property of my friend. There was good fishing in the lake, and that was the particular attraction that had drawn my other friends to this place. I myself was not very fond of angling. As I have said, we reached this place about 10:30 at night. We were received very kindly by the father and the mother of our host, who were a very jolly old couple, and after a very late supper, or shall I call it dinner, we retired. The guest rooms were well furnished, and very comfortable. It was a bright moonlight night, and our plan was to get up at 4 in the morning and go to the lake for angling. At 3 in the morning the servants of our host woke us up. They had come to carry our fishing gear, and we went to the lake, which was a couple of 100 yards from the house. As I have said, it was a bright moonlight night in summer, and the outing was not unpleasant after all. We remained on the bank of the lake till about 7 in the morning, when one of the servants came to fetch us for our morning tea. I may as well mention here that breakfast in India generally means a pretty heavy meal at about 10 a.m. I was the first to get up, for I have said already that I was not a worthy disciple of Isaac Walton. I wound up my line and walked away, carrying my rod myself. The lake was towards the back of the house. To come from the lake to the front of it we had to pass along the whole length of the buildings. See rough plan above. As would appear from the plan, we had to pass along the shady footpath, A, B, C, D, E. There was a turning at each point, B, C, D, and E. The back row of rooms was used for godowns, storerooms, kitchens, etc. One room, the one with the door marked star, at the corner, was used for storing a number of door frames. The owner of the house, our host's father, had at one time contemplated adding a new wing, and for that purpose the door frames had been made. Then he gave up the idea, and the door frames were kept stored up in that corner room, with a door on the outside marked star. Now as I was walking ahead, I reached the turning B first of all, and it was probably an accident that the point of my rod touched the door. The door flew open. I knew this was an unused portion of the house, and so the opening of the door surprised me to a certain extent. I looked into the room, and discovered the wooden door frames. There was nothing peculiar about the room or its contents either. When we were drinking our tea 5 minutes later, I casually remarked that they would find some of the door frames missing, as the door of the room in which they were kept had been left open all night. I did not at that time attach any importance to a particular look in the eyes of the old couple, my host's father and mother. The old gentleman called one of the servants and ordered him to bolt that door. When we were going to the lake in the evening, I examined the door and found it had been closed from the inside. The next morning we went out a-fishing again, and we were returning for our tea at about 7 in the morning. I was again ahead of all the rest. As I came along, this time intentionally I gave a push to the door with my rod. It again flew open. This is funny, I thought. At tea I reported the matter to the old couple, and then I noticed with curiosity their embarrassed look of the day before. I therefore suggested that the servants intentionally left the door open, and one morning they would find the door frames, stored in the room, gone. At this the old man smiled. He said that the door of this particular room had remained open for the last 15 years, and the contents had never been disturbed. On our pressing him why the door remained open, he admitted with great reluctance that since the death of a certain servant of the household in that particular room 15 years ago, the outer door had never remained closed. "You may close it yourself and see," suggested the old gentleman. We required no further invitation. Immediately we all went to that room to investigate, and find out the ghost if he remained indoors during the day. But Mr. Ghost was not there. "He has gone out for his morning constitutional," I suggested, "and this time we shall keep him out." Now this particular room had 2 doors and 1 window. The window and 1 door were on the courtyard side of the room, and communicated with the courtyard. The other door led to the grounds outside, and this last was the haunted door. We opened both the doors and the window and examined the room. There was nothing extraordinary about it. Then we tried to close the haunted door. It had warped probably by being kept open for 15 years. It had 2 very strong bolts on the inside, but the lower bolt would not go within 3 inches of its socket. The upper one was very loose, and a little continuous thumping would bring the bolt down. We thought we had solved the mystery thus. The servants only closed the door by pushing up the upper bolt. At night the wind would shake the door, and the bolt would come down. So this time we took good care to use the lower bolt. 3 of us pushed the door with all our might, and 1 man thrust the lower bolt into a socket. It hardly went in 1/4 of an inch, but still the door was secure. We then hammered the bolt in with bricks. In doing this we broke about 1/2 of them. This will explain to the reader how much strength it required to drive the bolt in about 1.5 inches. Then we satisfied ourselves that the bolt could not be moved, without the aid of a hammer and a lever. Afterwards we closed the window and the other door, and securely locked the last. Thus no human being could open the haunted door. Before retiring to bed after dinner, we further examined both doors once more. They were all right. The next morning we did not go out for fishing, so when we got up at about 5 in the morning, the first thing we did was go and examine the haunted door. It flew in at the touch. We then went inside and examined the other door and the window which communicated with the courtyard. The window was as secure as we had left it, and the door was chained from the outside. We went round into the courtyard and examined the lock. It did not appear to have been tampered with. The old man and his wife met us at tea as usual. They had evidently been told everything. They, however, did not mention the subject, neither did we. It was my intention to pass a night in that bedroom, but nobody would agree to bear me company, and I did not quite like the idea of passing a whole night in that ugly room. Moreover, my host would not have heard of it. The mystery of the open door has not yet been solved. It was about 20 years ago that what I have narrated above happened. I am not sure that the mystery will ever be solved. In this connection it will not be out of place to mention another incident with regard to another family and another house in another part of Bengal. Once, while coming back from Darjeeling, the summer capital of Bengal, I had a very garrulous old gentleman for a fellow traveller in the same compartment. I was reading a copy of the Occult Review, and the title of the magazine interested him very much. He asked me what the magazine was about, and I told him. He then asked me if I was really interested in ghosts and their stories. I told him that I was. "In our village we have a gentleman who has a family ghost," said my companion. "What kind of thing is a family ghost?" I asked. "Oh, the ghost comes and has his dinner with my neighbor every night," said my companion. "Really? It must be a very funny ghost," I said. "That is a fact. If you stay for a day in my village you will learn everything." I at once decided to break my journey in the village. It was about 2 in the afternoon when I got down at the railway station, procured a hackney carriage, and, ascertaining the name and address of the gentleman who had the family ghost, separated from my old companion. I reached the house in about 20 minutes, and told the gentleman that I was a stranger in those parts, and as such craved leave to pass the rest of the day and the night under his roof. I was a very unwelcome guest, but he could not kick me out, as the moral code would not permit it. He, however, shrewdly guessed why I was anxious to pass the night at his house. Of course, my host was very kind to me. He was a tolerably rich man with a large family. Most of his sons were grown-up young men who were at college in Calcutta. The younger children were of course at home. At night, when we sat down to dinner, I gently broached the subject by hinting at the rumor I had heard that his house was haunted. I further explained to him that I had only come to ascertain if what I had heard was true. He told me, of course it was very kind of him, that the story about the dinner was false, and what really happened was this. I had a younger brother who died 2 years ago. He was of a religious turn of mind, and passed his time in reading religious books and writing articles about religion in papers. He died suddenly one night. In fact, he was found dead in his bed in the morning. The doctor said it was due to failure of heart. Since his death he has come and slept in the room, which was his when he was alive and is his still. All that he takes is a glass of water fetched from the sacred river Ganges. We put the glass of water in the room and make the bed every evening. The next morning the glass is found empty and the bed appears to have been slept upon." "But why did you begin?" I asked. "Oh, one night he appeared to me in a dream, and asked me to keep the water and a clean bed in the room. This was about a month after his death," said my host. "Has anybody ever passed a night in the room to see what really happens?" I asked. "His young wife, or rather widow, passed a night in that room. The next morning we found her on the bed, sleeping, dead from heart failure, so the doctors said." "Most wonderful and interesting," I remarked. "Nobody has gone to that part of the house since the death of the poor young widow," said my host. "I have got all the doors of the room securely screwed up except one, and that too is kept carefully locked, and the key is always with me." After dinner my host took me to the haunted room. All arrangements for the night were being made, and the bed was neat and clean. A glass of the Ganges water was kept in a corner with a cover on it. I looked at the doors; they were all perfectly secure. The only door that could open was then closed and locked. My host smiled at me sadly. "We won't do all this uselessly," he said. "This is a very costly trick if you think it's a trick at all, because I have to pay to the servants double the amount that others pay in this village, otherwise they would run away. You can sleep at the door and see that nobody gets in at night." I said, "I believe you most implicitly, and need not take the precautions suggested." I was then shown into my room, and everybody withdrew. My room was 4 or 5 apartments off, and of course these apartments were to be unoccupied. As soon as my host and the servants had withdrawn, I took up my candle and went out to the locked door of the ghostly room. With lighted candle I covered the back of the lock with a thin coating of soot or lampblack. Then I scraped off a little dried-up whitewash from the wall and sprinkled the powder over the lampblack. "If anybody disturbs the lock at night I shall know it in the morning," I thought. Well, the reader could guess that I had not a good sleep that night. I got up at about 4:30 in the morning and went to the locked door. My seal was intact. That is, the lampblack with the powdered lime was there just as I had left it. I took out my handkerchief and wiped the lock clean. The whole operation took about 5 minutes. Then I waited. At about 5 my host came and a servant with him. The locked door was opened in my presence. The glass of water was dry, and there was not a drop of water in it. The bed had been slept upon. There was a distinct mark on the pillow where the head should have been, and the sheet too looked as if somebody had been in the bed the whole night. I left the same day by the afternoon train, having passed about 23 hours with the family in the haunted house. Thank you for listening.